Hi there, I'm Jackson from Modal Electronics, and I'm back today to talk about ARGON8's filters and modulation. So this is going to be quite an interesting tutorial to go through because we get to talk about the filters, which with any synthesizer is one of the most important features, but we also get to look at all of the different modulation options that we've got on ARGON8, of which there are some really interesting things that I'm going to pick out for this. So we're going to start off by looking at what the controls of the filter section are, how we change the different filter types, and then I'm going to start assigning some modulation to things. And what I'll do is, as I go through the course of this filming for you, I'm going to save some individual patches so that you kind of can get access to these different points and hear some of the difference that's going on here and kind of explore on your own. So you can go and download that. You probably will have already been sent an email with this in, but if you haven't got that yet, you can head over to the website and you can get that from the download section there, which is modalelectronics.com. You can go to the relevant product page of ARGON8, any of the ARGON8s should be fine. And if you go to the download section, you will find obviously all of our manuals and things like this, but you'll also find patches. Which is where these will be. So if you go and grab those, you can follow along, and you've also got a bunch of different things you can play with there. So to start off, we are going to look at the filter section, which is comprised of these three encoders here, and we've got the typical controls here. We have the cutoff and the resonance, which I'm sure everybody knows what they are, but for people who don't, the cutoff is the frequency that the filter is cutting by. So the lower we are, the softer the sound, and the higher we are, the brighter the sound. And then we have the resonance, which starts to pick out these harmonics. With the standard filter especially, we get these really rich harmonics peeking out when we play some nice chords here. Now, I mentioned the standard filter. There are 4 filter types on Argon, and they are all SVF filters, which means we can do this smooth morphing between a low pass, a band pass, and a high pass. That's true for all of the different filter types, but the morph has a slightly different function for some of them, and we'll come round to that. So in order to change the filter types, we just hold the patch button here and we turn the cutoff. So we have the standard filter, which we were just on. We've got the standard notch filter. We have a classic filter and a classic notch filter. So we have notch variations of the standard and the classic filters here. And what a notch is basically, if I bring the morph up here, this is how we control the notch. What a notch is basically bringing up a high shelf to make this kind of scoop that happens in the frequency range here, so in the filter range there. So we bring it in by using the morph control, and we can use the resonance to control the width of the notch. That's what a notch filter is. The difference between the filter types, the standard and the classic, is that the standard filter will pick out all of those rich harmonics from anything that you're playing. So if we're playing rich chords, we get these really beautiful harmonics that start to get picked out. And the classic filter is much more kind of like high resolution with the resonance. It's kind of more laser-like, and it doesn't pick out these harmonics in the same way. So if we go over to the classic filter, for example, and I just put some resonance on, you hear it's much smoother, much kind of more lasery than the standard filter. So this covers the controls for the filter section. We know that we have the filter cutoff frequency here. We've got the resonance here, and we've got the morph control, and we know that that does different things depending on what filter we're on. So we're going to move on to look at the envelopes. So when you think about filters, we really often, almost always, employ a filter envelope. This shapes the filter over time, and we also use envelopes for different things, for the amp and for modulation, and we can talk about that. We have looked at this in different videos, but we can talk about that specifically with the filters here. in a nice way, because we get to see kind of what happens when, for example, when we have no filter envelope employed. The filter rests at wherever I set it here, so it's static and it will just be consistent wherever I leave it. So when we start to increase the filter envelope depth, you notice that the filter starts to change, and that's because of this envelope shape that we have here. It is modulating from the point I set it at all the way up to the top here. It's sustaining until I let go of it, which is the release portion there. So if I want to have it back to where I left it, so you see the effect that the filter envelope has on the sound. It gives us over time the ability to open and close the filter, and we can set that kind of shape here, but we can also set the depth. Which can also be in a negative direction. So one thing that I like to do, this is one of my favorite kind of tricks, is to use the velocity to control the filter envelope depth. I use this to a whole bunch of different things, but I will almost always set this up just to have a little bit more expression from the keyboard. So if I just come back there, title like this. So it makes it much, much more expressive, and we can do some really, really interesting things to all sorts of things in here using that kind of modulation. So we could use the mod envelope to do similar things to, for example, the wave shapes, or we could use, you know, we can use this kind of depth trick that I showed you here with the LFOs as well. So we could do a velocity to the depth there, which is always really, really fun to do. So that brings me to the rest of these controls to the left over here, which is kind of where we set up our modulation. So we've got velo, aft, note, and expr. So what this is velocity, aftertouch, note, and expression. So the velocity is how hard we hit the keyboard, and we just set that up there. The aftertouch is what happens when we push into the keyboard. So I'm opening the filter a little bit at the moment with this. And in ARGON8's modulation matrix, which you can see up on the app here, we have 8 user-definable slots there, and we have 4 preset slots. So for these really common assignments like cutoff to note, or sorry, note to cutoff, aftertouch to cutoff, they're actually already baked in here. So you don't lose any mod slots kind of setting those parts up, which is a really nice little thing to have. So moving on from talking about these different parts here, obviously we could do note, which is the key scaling across the keyboard. So the lower I play, the lower the filter might be. And the expression, which we have a input on the back of the synthesizer here. So you can put in an expression pedal, and you can set up various different types of expression pedals. You can see in the settings, we have all of the different modes that you can change for the expression here, the different types of pedals. So that's really cool. And that also works with MPE, which is a really nice thing. I've got the Keith Macmillan Keyboard Pro 4 here, which has been really, really nice to get to grips with. I've only had it for about a week now, and I am really enjoying it. It's very, very different to the C boards, but very, very fun to play on. So we can set up some nice things for MPE using these things as well. So that covers this part of this first layer of the modulation on the panel here. And then underneath, as you see in blue here, if I hit shift, we have the X and Y controls here. So we can assign things to X plus, X minus, Y plus, and Y minus. So this can be really fun to modulate a whole bunch of different things. It doesn't just have to be the filter. You could modulate, for example, the effects, which we might do a little bit later on, or the wave shapes or the tuning, anything really that you can think of to modulate. Try putting them on here, see what that's like, because that can be really fun to play, you know, and you can find a nice different spot and we can lock the joystick in that position. So that's a nice one to look at there. What we're going to move on to look at now, we've done the filter envelopes and obviously all of the different types of modulation that we can assign from the panel here. We're going to look at the LFOs. So I'm going to assign an LFO to the filter and we're going to look at some of the different options that we have with the LFOs. So we've got LFO1 and LFO2, and LFO1 is a global LFO and LFO2 is a polyphonic LFO. So what that means is that we have one LFO here, which will just stay the same. It's just a single LFO that will affect anything at the rate as it is, and the trigger mode that it's in and the shape that it's in. It's just going to be as is. And then we have LFO2, which is our polyphonic LFO. So this is an 8-voice LFO, which means we can do some really, really cool things. So I'll show you how we can set that up now. So if I just hit the LFO and it starts to blink on the LED here, that indicates that we are in an assign mode, and that's the same for any of these assignable parameters. So the mod EG for the velocity, for example, or as I'm in shift, that was the X plus for the velocity if I wanted to assign it, or the expression if I wanted to assign it, or Y plus shift. There we go. This is how we know we're in an assign mode, and it's one of those indicators to kind of pull back if we're looking at these things and you see something flashing and you're filling up the modulation matrix, you know to come back out of that, and you can remove some of those erroneous modulation settings there. I made one earlier, so I've actually just taken it off there. So to assign an LFO to the filter, we simply hit the LFO button and we turn the filter. So this gives us a depth, and I can do bipolar depth here as well. So from 0, positive 64 to minus 63 there. So what we can do with this is use the LFO to periodically and repetitively open and close the filter. Now you can hear with this one being a polyphonic LFO, they all happen slightly differently there depending on how I play them in. If I did that, for example, with LFO1, you can hear that it's much more static of modulation there. And I'm just going to turn this one up a little bit so we can concentrate on LFO2 again. we've made some nice modulation kind of assignments there. We've taken LFO2 and we've put it onto the filter, and you can see how they all start to dance independently because it's polyphonic. There are 8 different LFOs there that are all running alongside each other, that are opening and closing on their own. So this is super, super cool, and one of the really nice, unique features to ARGON8. So what I showed you there was increasing the rate and decreasing the rate. As I decrease and I go beyond 0 to the left, you see that I start to go to these tempo synced divisions, and then we have our free rate from 0 to 63, and then we come into these different frequency divisions here. So they're denoted by an F beforehand, and these are really, really interesting. What this basically means is that filter is, or the LFO I should say, is tied to the, this is quite difficult to explain, but basically the filter is opening and closing at a division of the fundamental frequency of the note that you're playing. So if you're playing, you know, for example, an A at 440, you know that this filter is now opening and closing by the LFO at some division of 440 hertz. So it's always going to be perfect, and it's always going to be related to each note. So actually, depending on which note that you play, it's going to change the speed of the LFO. So this is a really, really cool one. And as I go really, really high up there, we get these overtones and these undertones start to build as the filter is opening and closing so fast. It starts to become its own kind of modifier on the kind of oscillator, it almost sounds like. So I then went and I attached the velocity to the depth there, so that the harder I played, the more of this kind of frequency division modulation from the LFO was showing, which is a really, really kind of complex thing to try and get your head around. But when you kind of do start to play with this, you hear this crazy, crazy expressivity start to happen. And obviously there's a lot of fine tuning that needs to go into these things, but here's a few things that I would usually play with, is kind of assigning the velocity to the depth, for example, of the LFOs or of the filter envelope. But one other thing that's really, really common that we haven't touched on is this mod envelope over here. So this is something that I use an awful lot just to get some movement, either in pitch or in kind of transient shapes or evolving shapes using the wave dials. So to show you what that sounds like, I'm just going to hit the Mod EG button, and again it flashes to notify me that I'm in an assignment mode, and I'm just going to assign it to this wave 1. And why not just use Y plus, and we'll do that to the second wave as well, so we've got a bit of both that we can hear and we can play with. So I'm now going to tie the velocity to the OSC mod as well. done a few more crazy assignments here. Just going to go ahead and save that for you. So what I'm going to do now is just do some kind of nice sprinkling of bits to get some width going on, and I'm going to play with a bit of the spread to kind of make some more thickness here. Make some effects out of that. hey there. So I've made some interesting patches here. We've made some kind of padsy patches, and then we went into some unison patches. We've made some crazy effects and this bass here. Just going to tidy up a little bit before I save for you. And this gives you a kind of idea of how we can use the LFOs in tandem with the mod EG and the filter EG to make something that's aggressive and evolving and really just nice and interesting. And we're also looking at some of the nice drift and width that we can use here, given that we're in unison. Let's see what it sounds like in stack as well, actually, just to give it a try. Okay, we're just going to tidy this up. There we go. Cool, so I've just changed some of the assignments there. We've got quite a gnarly little bass going on, so I'm just going to save that. Cool, so I guess something quickly to point out is the other functions of the LFOs. So if I just go here, obviously we had the rate and the depth that we looked at. There's also, if we go to the shift layer, the shape, which is really, really great if we use some of these random shapes here. You can get some really interesting things happening with these. And you can also use the mode to have, for example, the LFOs running free, or just to have a single cycle. So if you use that, for example, with this guy, you're going to get some really interesting results. It's going to be random every time you press it, completely new value, which is great. So that covers the different modes and the different shapes that we can get to for the LFO. The next thing that we're going to look at is the animators. So this is a really cool feature that we have in our sequencer. We've got a real-time sequencer in here, which you can do either some really nice smooth animation, or we can do step modulation if you go into the step sequencer mode. So I'm going to show you quickly how we can record in I'm just going to record in some nonsense because I know I've got an empty sequence here, and we're just going to go and see what comes out of it. Okay, so I just recorded a whole bunch of stuff in there. Obviously, you just had a click. It's probably really irritating, but I recorded a whole bunch of stuff into the sequencer animation lanes here, and you can see on Modal app, if I just look at the different anims here, these are the different animations I just put in. Really cool. And we've got one empty here, which I haven't quite touched, mix. We'll leave that there for now. So what's going on at the moment is that the sequence is playing and it is actually adjusting all of those values. So as I hold down a chord, it is scanning through all those animation values. So you can use this really as another kind of set of modulators. We have 4 animators that you can use here, which can do kind of a crazy infinitely more detailed shape than the LFOs. If you wanted, you could draw in LFOs just simply like this, or we could do more specific things. And where it gets interesting is where you use the step sequencer, for example. So if I come into the step sequencer and I go anim1 here, and now I just type in cutoff and I just start to do some random modulation here. Great to begin with, but it'll do. And I'll go and put in some more quickly here of the wave one, for example, every now and again. We'll just blast that in there. And let's just go for a third to the OSP mod. Okay, so now if I play my sequence, okay, so what's happened here is that I haven't put any steps in, so I'm going to go and set the step length. We're going to go for 16 steps. Now when I press play, see this working. So a little tip there, if you aren't paying attention like I wasn't, and you're coming into the step sequencer mode, make sure that you give it a set of steps if you intend to kind of just draw in straight animation like this. So there we can see some really cool stuff that you can do with the animators, and this can be a whole different world to get into because of how in depth they are and how different these two modes are. We can start to open this up much like the kind of Waves used to with their step automation, and much like we did with the 002, for example, with the animators. You can do some really nice and interesting things with this now. And this opens ARGON8 up to be an absolute beast when it comes to evolving things, which I think is why we see so many ambient producers kind of leaning in towards this, because there are so many different modulation options that you can get to get this really subtle beating and kind of these different textures to slowly evolve out and to evolve in a way that's kind of interesting over time as well. So animators is definitely one I would recommend that you look into and have a play with, because it can be really powerful just to use the sequencer without any notes with the animators. So one of the other things that we can do that I mentioned earlier is that we can modulate some of the effects. So I'm going to come back to the initial patch that we're on here, and we're going to put some effects on quickly. So I'm just going to hold all three of the buttons and it comes up with this load effects, and I can now FX1, FX2 and FX3 that I held down there. I can now go through all of the effects presets that we put in. So I put in, I think initially 50, and there are another 50 that have just been added with the 2.0 firmware update downloads. So you can get those up on the website modalelectronics.com, as I mentioned earlier, and I can load up some interesting effects. So one of the things that I like to do to kind of make things a little bit more weird and a bit more spacey is, God, I do love weird things, is using the LFO to adjust this delay time. So I'm going to now pick LFO 1 and I'm going to go to this delay time that I had here. I'm just going to do a tiny bit. It's the wrong thing, didn't I? FX1B. So you can get really carried away with the effects and modulating them with the LFOs. We can go from this really kind of obvious tape warbling to this really spacey, slow Boards of Canada-esque kind of modulation. And what I would encourage you to do is just to go through some of the presets like we did here, choose a different effects preset and just see what you can modulate in there to kind of make things move around a bit, because there are some really, really interesting combinations there. I'm not going to give them all away because, you know, it kind of spoils the fun. But there are some really, really nice things that you can do there. And especially with using things like spread with the modulation, there's some really, really nice stuff you can get out of that. So there's a few things there for you to check out. And I think that kind of wraps it up for effects, for filters and modulation in general. Yeah, so we're going to jump back to the webinar now, and hopefully you guys have been busy in the chat room, and I can type any of the questions that you've had over the duration of this presentation, and I hope you enjoyed it and got something useful out of it. We will be back again in probably 2 weeks' time with another webinar, so keep your eyes open for the announcement on that on our social media channels. And yeah, go and check out the downloads on our website, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Thanks.